A few months ago, Ben and I were in Mexico, and we spent a week in Puerto Vallarta, which is known as one of the safest places in the world for LGBTQ travel. And while we were there, we did a sailing tour out to see whales and the little islands and stuff. There were about 10 people on the tour. Ben and I sat at the front of the boat with this older couple from Canada. I was wearing my little gay swimsuit. Ben was wearing his littler, gayer swimsuit. We were drinking Cosmos, we were holding hands, we were just enjoying being out. And at a certain point, Ben went to the bathroom, and I was chatting with this Canadian couple, and the woman asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a pastor." And if human beings could glitch, she glitched. Like, the Speedo, the Cosmo, the hand-holding, that all fit. Pastor didn't fit. And it was a memorable look she gave me. And this has happened to us more than once. It's always amusing. I never get tired of it. And it normally leads to a really interesting conversation. But it's also sad, because it's a reminder that the radical welcome we practice here at Salt House is really super rare. And this Sunday, we're talking about radical welcome because radical welcome is the gospel, affirming the dignity, celebrating the diversity, expanding the community to include the unincluded. These are the things that Jesus did, and it's the work that we continue to do as the church. And this year it is especially important. A lot of LGBTQ groups have been saying online that this year the mantra for Pride shouldn't be love is love. This year, the mantra should be queer people are in danger. And as a warning, I'm going to give some really troubling statistics here. In the legislative session that just ended this year, more than 525 bills limiting gay rights were introduced in 41 different states. Over 220 of those bills specifically targeted trans people, and over 76 were signed into law. More anti-gay legislation was introduced in the last 6 months than any other period in American history. 21 states have banned transgender athletes from participating in sports. 20 states banned gender-affirming healthcare, and 9 states banned trans folks from using the bathroom of their gender identity. A study published earlier this year by the Trevor Project found that 38% of transgender girls experience homelessness. The same is true for 39% of transgender boys and 35% amongst non-binary youth. And overall, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth will experience homelessness in their life. An increase in assault against queer folks has led the Human Rights Campaign for the first time ever to declare a state of emergency for queer folks in the United States. And due to threat of violence, queer folks from other countries are advised not to visit the US. In 2023. Like, who would have thought? And when I think of all this violence, I think of a story in the Bible where Jesus goes to an unsafe city, encounters an abandoned, demon-possessed man, and in healing him, reveals something about liberation. So danger, abandonment, liberation, kind of feels like Pride Month. So let's take a look. You'll find this story in Mark 5. I think it's also on the bulletin insert and on the bulletin page. And the story starts with Jesus taking his disciples across the lake to the Decapolis. The Decapolis was a metropolitan area in the ancient world. Deca means 10 and polis means city, so it's a network of 10 cities. It was largely built during and immediately after the reign of Alexander the Great. And the Decapolis was not Jewish. It was a very Gentile area, which means the culture was queer. Oh, sorry, Greek. That's a Freudian slip. And by that, they would have eaten a Greek diet. Sports would have been done in the nude. There was Greek-style bathhouses. Theater was popular. In a lot of ways, the Decapolis might have been like the ancient version of Vegas. You'd probably have a good time, but you wouldn't want to talk about it at work, and your parents may not approve. But the writer of this gospel gets specific. He says that Jesus took his disciples to Gerasa, and Gerasa had a particularly tragic history. The Jewish historian Josephus lived at the same time as the gospel writers, and this is what he wrote about Gerasa. Roman general Vespasian sent Lucius Annius to Gerasa and delivered to him a legion of horsemen and a considerable number of footmen, When he had taken the city, which he did at first onset, he slew 1,000 young men. He took their families captive, and then he permitted his soldiers to plunder them of their effects. After which he set fire to their houses and went away to the adjoining villages. When the men of power, the strongest men, fled away, the weaker men were destroyed, and what was remaining was all burnt down. So Gerasa was completely destroyed and impoverished by the Roman army. Legions of soldiers invaded, men were conscripted or killed, women and children were used and sold, all property was seized, the city was burnt to the ground. Gerasa was totally overrun by Romans. And yet we find a story where Jesus goes to Gerasa. I imagine when Jesus tells his disciples he's going there, there was probably some pushback. I mean, for one, it's the Decapolis, so it's this Gentile territory, outside of the tradition, culturally foreign, mom will not approve. But beyond that, it's Gerasa, like bad, genocidal things happen here. But you know what's cool about that? The story starts by breaking up a binary. The story starts by Jesus ignoring this Jew versus Gentile territory separation. And isn't that what Jesus often does? The place that you think is beyond saving, those people that you think are hopeless, that very thing that you fear. No, God is there too. God is always interested in going to and including people that we are quick to judge or dismiss. And if the story couldn't be even more on the nose, scholars think the name Gerasa derives from the Jewish word garash, which means to expel or banish. In essence, Gerasa is a city that's very name means the banished place. And queer people know what it's like to live in a banished place. I mean, in my own story, I remember sitting on the floor at the foot of my bed, absolutely terrified. I don't have one of those coming out stories where I always knew I was gay. I mean, in hindsight, I can connect the dots. But it wasn't like I knew when I was 11 and tried to hide it. It wasn't me. I dated girls in college. I was 24 when I started to question things. And I remember going home for Christmas and sitting on the floor at the foot of my bed. Because in my brain, if I came out, I thought I'd lose everything. I never really worried about my family rejecting me, but I knew it would change things. I worried my friends wouldn't want to go camping anymore. I worried I wouldn't be able to get a job or a promotion. I worried I'd have to stop traveling because it would be dangerous, or that I'd get hate crimed. I sat in my room and just imagined all the things I loved being taken from me and irreversibly changed. It would be like being banished. Coming out can feel like going to Gerasa. And I wonder if there's a Gerasa in your story. Is there a hopeless place? A place that you fear? Is there a place that you think, I can't go there? I can't take that risk. I can't be associated with that. The Spirit of God often calls us to do scary and risky things because transformation is rarely possible without a little bit of danger. So what risky place is God calling you to go? Part of radical welcome is going to risky places. It means crossing the sea to do unexpected things. Salt House is doing that this season by going to Pride events. And I'm not saying Pride is dangerous, but I am saying that it's an unexpected place to see a church. And there have been people that haven't wanted us there and have asked church groups not to attend for some really understandable reasons. But Salt House will risk rejection. We'll risk confrontation because we know that we are called by God to be a source of love in a world that avoids risk and confrontation. And that's one of the ways that we practice radical welcome as a community. But on with the story. When Jesus arrives in Gerasa, he finds himself in a cemetery on the outskirts of town. Because you know Jesus likes to see the sights when he travels. And so think about this. Have you ever been in a cemetery? You're aware of death and sorrow and heartache. Well, take it up a notch. Because Gerasa was slaughtered. I mean, there wasn't just death, there was a lot of death. The Romans invented crucifixion, which was basically like, how do we keep you alive as long as possible and in pain without actually killing you, and then kill you? Have you ever been to a memorial for a large-scale death, like the Vietnam Wall or the Holocaust Museum? Like a place where tragedy is compounded by atrocity? I imagine that's what this cemetery was like. So much tragedy that you can smell the heartache in the air. You can almost hear the tears of mourners from years ago. The air is stagnant and the gravitas is so great, you can't move. Goosebumps on your skin, you freeze, not sure where to look, not sure what to do, and suddenly there's a noise. A man rushes towards Jesus, and this is how the text describes him. A man with an unclean spirit came out and met Jesus. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. So think about this. This man survived this invasion in Gerasa. Most of the men were executed, many of them fled, but this man fought back and fought such that the Romans could not kill nor restrain him, and they tried. They used chains, they used shackles, they abandoned him to live among the tombs, and he kept fighting. Like, this gives me chills when I think about queer folks. Many queer folks have been killed, banished, sometimes fleeing to safe places, but often we fought back. Despite legislation, despite don't say gay bills, despite loss of health care, despite having our rights debated in public, stripped, and violated. Chains and shackles couldn't hold us. Even amongst the tombs, we kept living, and we keep fighting. But that fight comes at a cost. Because did you hear the other part about this man? Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. Howling and bruising himself with stones. How many queer people hurt themselves because they hate themselves? Because society has called them disgusting or sinful or wrong, because they were bullied at school, because they were rejected, because they were kicked out of church or other sacred community. Queer people attempt suicide at twice the national average. But again, let's remember what this man went through. I mean, his city was destroyed, his friends killed, perhaps he had a wife and children taken. He's seen violence and fire and death. That is a lot to cope with. The numbing could get real. I mean, have you ever felt so traumatized, you're like, I just want to feel something, even if that something is pain? That can be a really lonely but relatable way to feel. Or have you ever had survivor's guilt? Thoughts like, oh, I didn't do enough. That can be a maddening thing. It can make you want to bash your head against a rock. I just find this man among the tombs so relatable. I actually preached the same text at a church in Boulder back in 2021, before I moved to Seattle. I was taking a preaching class in seminary, and I had a project to preach about a controversial topic. They called it our prophetic sermon project. So I reached out to this church and asked if I could do my project there and preach about LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And they said, absolutely. And I went and I preached, and they invited me to join them for their midweek study on Zoom to talk more. I got invited back to help with their Ash Wednesday service. They were great people. They really helped me along in my seminary journey. And in the 2 months I was involved with that congregation, we spent 2 weeks talking about LGBT issues, and I never came out to them. That sermon is on YouTube. You can watch it, and when I do, I can see the moment in my eyes where I'm pausing and deciding, do I say we or they when I talk about the queer community? And I said they. I spoke about gay people in the third person the entire time. As an outsider looking in, I was trying to help the gays. I wasn't one of them. And that sermon was a defining moment for me in recognizing that I was a good preacher. I'm really proud of it, but I hate that sermon. It makes me want to bash my head against a rock because I feel like I let the community down. I feel like I betrayed myself. I feel like I gave in and I was part of the problem. In a modern day version of this story, perhaps the man in the cemetery who's lost everything, maybe he's a trans woman who's been denied health care, or a gay man whose family won't take the call. He could be the lesbian whose children won't speak to her after coming out, or perhaps the bisexual who can't come out to their spouse. But he could also be the ally who wished they'd done more. I mean, there's lots of pain that makes you want to beat your head against a rock. And this is part of Radical Welcome too. This is why at Salt House we say you can bring your full self here. Your gender and your sexuality, yes, but also your grief and your pain, your questions, your hurts. All of you is welcome at Salt House. Now, in this story, Jesus does what Jesus often does. He casts out the demon from within this man. And over the years, a lot of pastors and theologians have said awful things about this story. They've said that demons cause queerness, or that demons cause disability, or demons cause depression or illness, any number of things. And so I guess that means Jesus just shows up and casts out demons to make people normal? I mean, how boring would that Jesus be? And that's not what the story says either. In fact, the story tells us that exactly who the demon is. Jesus asked the demon, "What is your name?" And the demon says, "Legions." Legions. Like the Roman military. Like the legions of Roman soldiers who destroyed Gerasa. This man was possessed and driven to madness by the violence he experienced. The demons inside him were trauma, terror, pain, guilt, fear, shame. God created this man in the image of God, and that divine spark was trampled by the violence of the Roman Empire. So what dulls your spark? Can you name your demons? In the ancient world, there was a belief that if you knew a demon's name, you could control it. But if you can't name your demons, you can't control them. This man was possessed by trauma and violence. A lot of queer people feel the same. Or how many queer folks feel left for dead and possessed by the demon of internalized homophobia? How many LGBTQ folks contemplate suicide because of the violent rhetoric in our society? I have journal entries from before I came out where I was processing what I thought would happen to me, and over again, I used the word disgusting. That's the word that I internalized. And I didn't want to be disgusting. Not talking about the shirt. Because I don't care who you love. I mean, maybe you have some of these demons too. And maybe something that someone said to you about your body has haunted you your whole life. Maybe you've been touched in ways you didn't want. Maybe you've been pressured to be more manly or more ladylike, told you couldn't wear that or makes you look fat. Told, "Oh, you're a big girl, aren't you?" Or, "Come on, don't be a sissy." Maybe you've been misgendered or dead named. Any of these demons sound familiar? Part of the reason we call our LGBTQ group queer here at Salt House is to take back that word, to reclaim the power that it has. It's not bullying anymore. It's radical welcome to use language in ways that heal instead of harm. And the funny thing is, Jesus does not negotiate with demons. Like most of the time, across the gospel, he doesn't even allow them to speak. When Jesus casts out a demon, we're often told that he silences the demon. It's as if these voices of shame and trauma do not speak accurately. They aren't the voice of God. In fact, they lie about the nature of God. So Jesus does not negotiate with demons. He shuts them up. And in this story, he drives them into the sea. When it comes to shame, Jesus just won't hear it. When it comes to self-hatred, Jesus isn't interested in compromise or meeting halfway. Whatever messages society gives you about your body, your dignity, your sexuality, or your gender, Jesus won't hear it. It's not the voice of God. Jesus casts out those demons and drives them into the sea. And that's good news. But there's a twist in the story, because when the people of Gerasa hear and see what Jesus did, they ask him to leave. And isn't that ironic? Isn't that how liberation often goes? We see it and we fear it. Like, here comes Jesus casting out shame, healing trauma. It's tempting to be like, "No, Jesus, we need you to leave." They might be demons, but there are demons. They might be violent, but at least it's home. I'm sure there's a lot of psych research about why things stay status quo. Maybe it's attachment theory, or maybe we all have Stockholm syndrome. But over and over again in the story of God, when we see how messy healing is, we ask Jesus to leave. I mean, in the end, this liberation stuff is what gets him killed. We often listen to those voices of shame and trauma and anxiety because they are loud, but they're not the voice of God, and they never have the last word in the story. I love calling Ben my boyfriend in public. It feels kind of gay. But there are times I'm talking to someone and I can't quite read them, so I'll say partner instead. And there are times I'm walking on the street and I don't quite feel safe, so I'll curl my fingers and put them in my pockets to hide the polish. And most of the time I go to Harborview for work, I'll take off the rainbow bracelets because I want to be taken seriously as a professional, like a real Christian, a real pastor, a relatable guy. And I realize as I say those things that somehow this means I'm not. There's still that voice in my head that says, maybe this is disgusting. Those voices of shame, trauma, and anxiety are loud, but they're not the voice of God. Beloved is what God says. And this story shows us that too. The man who Jesus healed comes to Jesus, and he and the disciples are loading up the boat, and he says he wants to follow him. And it's easy to think like, oh, sweet, mission accomplished. Another one saved, Team Jesus, here we go. But Jesus says no. He says no. Rob Bell refers to this as the maybe Jesus doesn't want you to follow him story. What Jesus tells the man who's been healed is go home. Which I think makes it tempting to think this is the Hallmark ending. Like he's been chained and isolated in the cemetery. Now he's going home, healed with a new lease on life. Like the credits roll and Hans Zimmer does like the orchestra thing. But I imagine for this man, the words go home are complicated. Because as many queer folks know, sometimes you can't go home. Sometimes you can't go back. Sometimes home is full of pain, it's full of violence. Sometimes there's no home to go back to. And this man knows that. Going home would be a challenging story. And I don't think Jesus is sending this man into a violent situation, but I think Jesus is telling this man that this cemetery, this death sentence, this is not your home. This is not your story. Your life was blown off track by the things people said and did to you, and now you're free. You get to live a new story. Don't let them ever call you a demoniac again. Go home and be proud. In essence, Jesus is telling this man to come out. This man wasn't the only one impacted by violence in Gerasa. The whole community is still clinging to their trauma. They're choosing pain over liberation. The healed man returns to his community as a living example. He demonstrates that by casting out his demons of violence, opportunities for transformation, reconciliation, and hope abound for everyone. Have you ever wished that you could just like bottle the liberation you've experienced and give it to other people? Like if you find that perfect book, that relative will finally get it. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Love changes people, not facts or arguments or logic, but love. And it's why coming out is so important and why Pride Month is so important. We need people who have been tormented by their demons and healed by love to be visible. They show us that healing and love are possible. They show us that healing and love are the will of God. It's always a risky thing to come out, but it's also a risky thing to say, I'm a Christian and I support gay people. Or a risky thing to say, I'm a church that not only allows queerness, but celebrates it. Or to say a risky thing like, I want to do something about racial inequality. I'm going to pay reparations. And often these risky conversations are hardest to have at home. So this man going home is not literally being sent into a burned down house that he lived in. He's not turning the clock back and pretending it's okay when it's not. The text tells us that he goes to the Decapolis and tells people his story. That's what going home is about. It's Jesus telling him to go use his story to heal a traumatized world. And to be clear, no one ever has to come out. There are lots of reasons not to. No one should compromise their safety to come out. No one should come out when they aren't ready. No one should come out to meet anyone's expectations. But coming out, owning your story, sharing your story with others can be liberative for you and for the world. Because let's be honest, homophobia doesn't just harm queer people. It also harms society with toxic ideas of gender roles, like who can and can't be a pastor. It creates emotional repression by telling us who can and can't cry. It leads to sexual repression, which often leads to sexual violence. We all benefit from queer liberation. And that's true of liberation everywhere. Like racism, ableism, classism, gender discrimination, there's some major demons we still need to drive into the sea. But that's good news for everyone, because that's what the kingdom of God looks like. So part of the way we practice radical welcome at Salt House is by sharing our stories and hearing each other's stories. So, what part of your story is God calling you to share? What hurts or griefs or traumas are you wrestling with? Could you share that pain here in this community? Could we hold it for you? Could we learn together and heal together? Well, my friends, those are just a few thoughts for you this Pride Month. And my hope is that regardless of your sexuality or gender identity, that you may find liberation in this season of celebrating queerness. May you go to the banished places that you fear and see that God is there too. May you name your demons and start to heal your violence, your trauma, your shame, your guilt, and your grief. And may you live out and proud, sharing your story and being your full, authentic self with the world. Because the world needs you. The world needs you. This is your home. This is what Radical Welcome is all about. Amen.